Sup fellas, my name is MrTastix, and I'm here to talk about Wolcen Lords of Mayhem, an action role-playing game that just released out of early access on Steam, and is hitting the news in the YouTube space for what I would say is all the wrong reasons. But rather than have a generic review where I tell you the good and the bad stuff about the game, I'm just going to give a brief rundown of my own personal experience, as well as some of the backstory of the game and why I am not fond of this game or the company behind it. I guess we just have to start off with what Wolcen is. Wolcen is an action role-playing game. It originally started off life back in May 2015 as a Kickstarter campaign. They were looking for around $225,000 but managed to amass over $400,000. At the time it was called Umbra and was being spearheaded by Solarfall Games. But about a year later they had changed the name of the game and the studio to Wolcen, citing copyright issues being the reason. The thing about Wolcen was that, as the Kickstarter mentions, it was originally designed to be an open world game, and for all intents and purposes this was pretty much the accepted state until about a year ago when all things changed. But we're getting quite ahead of ourselves here. The major selling points for Wolcen were a shape-shifting apocalyptic form that granted extra abilities and was fully customizable, a complex crafting minigame, and a housing module which was added quite early on into the alpha and from what I remember was pretty robust at the time. There was also to be a mature story, which was supposed to be like other role-playing games where your choices mattered. Right, yeah, sure, I've heard that one before. Their brief description, and I quote, "We are mixing the freedom of Skyrim, the action style of Diablo 3, the ambience of Diablo 1, the graphical power of Crisis, and adding our very own features on top of all that to come up with a unique and powerful gameplay." Yeah, alright. The open world part was what really caught my eye at the time. It was supposed to be this huge map with a base size of like 4 kilometers squared, which, might I add, is a fucking useless metric and I wish people would stop regurgitating it like it matters. 1 meter in your game doesn't necessarily translate to 1 meter in another game. I mean, ignoring the fact that this doesn't even factor into like player speed, even if it did, who fucking cares? Morrowind is a really huge map, but at the end of the day, you're still roaming around 80% of it with brown grey hills and nothing else. Case in point, The Witcher 3's map is about 3 times the size of Skyrim's, but it feels empty as fuck, because at each point of interest there's basically nothing to do. And unlike Skyrim, it lacks pretty much all the verticality. No mountains, hills, etc., right? So yeah, sure, your map might be bigger in the game editor, but if it doesn't fucking feel better, who cares? That's kind of all that really matters. Moving on. Wolcen's open world was going to have entrances to randomly generated caves and dungeons that you could explore, kill mobs, get loot, etc. And during the early access, both these things were true. There was a relatively large open world, though notably empty given the alpha stage, and there were interiors you could enter and do traditional hack and slash stuff. All this was, as far as I'm concerned, a positive. It had all the potential and signs of an interesting game, so I figured, fuck it, I'll check it out. I got the DRM free version on GOG because it was on sale at the time. Tried it out and thought, yeah, it's pretty early going, as expected for an alpha, but it was alright. It had the open world, it had the dungeons, and it even had some of the basic housing features, which I thought were really good, especially since, there wasn't a lot in terms of player-owned housing in the gaming market at the time. So honestly, I expect it to be really fucking good now. Well, I hope, since it was a major selling feature, right? The game was originally set to be released in October 2016, but that didn't happen. Honestly, it's not too surprising that Wolcen's devs bit off a bit more than they could chew. Action role-playing games are a little bit more complex than people give them credit for, and the early access we had at that point was a great tech demo, but very, very far from being released. It lacked a cohesive story or reason for why you even exist, it lacked a lot of the base content such as skills, dungeons and monsters, and the overworld, while pretty, was pretty barren for a very long time. Some of this was solved in 2017 when a ton of foundation content was added. Content that's not going to last a veteran a very long time, but still super important. Things like skills, additional passives, NPCs, etc. However, by 2018, we hadn't even had what Wolcen themselves considered a true Act 1. The core features weren't even in at this point. Multiplayer, the apocalyptic shapeshifting form, an actual story. Remember, it was supposed to be a mature story where your choices mattered, alongside the other basic content of monsters, skills, items, etc. At this point, players were starting to worry a little bit if the game was actually going to come out at all. And yet, September 2018 was to be the beta release. A pivotal part in any software release cycle where all the core features should be pretty much finished at that point, and the only thing that's really left to do is bug testing, polish, general quality assurance stuff. At this point, Wolcen Studios should be really hammering down getting ready for the prime time. Oh, and one of those major selling points, the open world? Yeah, that's not happening anymore. It's honestly not too surprising given the scope and scale that open world games generally have, but it was still massively disappointing, and 2018 was that time where I was fully disillusioned and disenfranchised by Kickstarters in general. I mean, they just promise you everything and then deliver you nothing, and Wolcen Studios was honestly shaping up to be more of the same. At this point, there would be no major updates for the game for a while. It was all hands on deck to get ready for that September beta release. And then September 2018 came. And the beta didn't. In October 2018, a month after the supposed beta was set to release, the CEO of Wolcen Studio made an announcement that Wolcen, and I quote, will not be a mixture of several games, and that we decided to restart the game from scratch, which ultimately means what we got those few days later was dramatically different than what I originally paid money for. It wasn't the open world ARPG it was marketed as by any stretch of the imagination. But hey, beta was here at least, or at least the phase 1 of the beta was. What kind of a beta has a fucking release candidate anyways? And I'm also not sure what the CEO meant about that whole won't be a mixture thing, because the game's out now and it looks even more like a Diablo ripoff than it ever did during the alpha. And why does he market that like it's a bad thing? As if Blizzard Entertainment hasn't spent the last 20 years making millions of dollars off well-made clones. There's nothing wrong with taking an existing idea and improving upon it. In any case, these technical phases for the beta weren't a permanent thing. Mid-December 2018, they cut off access to the experimental branch on Steam, and that was it. A beta so great it doesn't even fucking exist anymore and won't do until March 2019. Good. So players had already spent half a year waiting without any update, only to wait another 4 to 5 months for a game that wasn't even what it was originally promised to be. Fucking wonderful. Oh, and anyone playing the GOG version, like myself, didn't get any of this. And this is where my anger and frustration with Wolcen and Wolcen Studios primarily comes from. The relatively slow development time and the dramatic change of direction I could understand. That shit happens. Personally, I don't really consider it acceptable to go on Kickstarter and promise a bunch of things that you have no hope of delivering, but hey, that's why Kickstarter's a fucking dumpster fire and I don't use it. No, what truly upset me was that throughout this entire period, the GOG version basically got nothing. And when March 2019 rolled around, the entire game was shit-canned from the face of the GOG storefront because they couldn't be asked to keep fucking both versions updated. I'm not exactly sure why they couldn't do that, but I have 3 primary theories. The first was that they didn't want to have a DRM-free version. I don't really consider that a compelling argument, but okay. The second is that they found it harder to update on the GOG platform at the time than Steam. Fine. Sure. Still a dick move, but at least that's somewhat understandable. And the third reason was because they wanted to use the Steam API for the multiplayer version of the game, which was, as we know, a major version, and GOG didn't have their own multiplayer API at the time. But, I mean, frankly, given the past week and all the multiplayer problems that players have been experiencing, I don't think they would have fucking mattered. And not to mention that GOG does have multiplayer support for games now. Once this got out, they naturally offered Steam keys, but only if you had actual proof of purchase. Okay, makes sense. In a fucking physical retailer 30 years ago. So I have to send screenshots of my digital receipt for a game that I bought 3 years prior. I don't keep invoices for that long because, frankly, why would I? Once I've confirmed that the payment has been processed and that I've got the game on my account, I don't tend to expect it to just be completely removed from the storefront. Frankly, I just keep receipts for like 6 months as a sort of peace of mind thing, just in case, and then that's it. I delete them and forget about it. I mean, hell, even if it was a gifted copy, which mine version wasn't, the reality is that it's not the game it was originally promised. It's not an early access game, with the implication that it will be constantly updated until a final release. So, frankly, anyone who actually owned the game should be immediately entitled to either a refund from Wolcen and not GOG, or a Steam key, right? Should have been ample enough to prove it since it's on my account, right? Not to mention the complete lack of communication this whole situation had. The refund thing was posted on the Steam forums and only because somebody asked about it. Nowhere was this mentioned on GOG, and nowhere were owners of the Wolcen game on GOG emailed about this whatsoever. Hell, even the announcement that it was being removed from the GOG storefront was made by a GOG representative and not Wolcen. They didn't even have the backbone to actually make that claim themselves. So, at this point, I told Wolcen Studios to go fuck themselves and got GOG to refund my money as store credit, and since that time, I have been patiently waiting for Cyberpunk 2077 to come out so that I can hopefully play a real fucking game. All this, and I've ignored the fact that honestly, Wolcen isn't that great. It's a complete buggy mess with problems such as random deletions of your character, half a second of input lag for basically any input, skill runes that don't function, passive perks that function too well, causing you to basically just one-shot the bosses randomly, bosses that have no loot, online multiplayer that has a server cap, like a player limit, but no queue to allow you to actually log in at some point, and finally, bosses that teleport around the room in the fucking T-posed position while you're fighting them. It's a fucking mess! It's not just that they got over $400,000 on Kickstarter. It's not even that it's a completely different game than what was originally promised. It's the fact that not only did they screw over an entire fucking platform, right? They have atrociously poor communication skills, but then, after all of this, they have the fucking gall to fully release what is clearly an unfinished product and double the price while doing it. That's not acceptable. That's not even fucking remotely acceptable. Alrighty fellas, ignoring the fact that it's clearly a completely different day since I've shaved half my face and I'm wearing a different top, that is it for me and Wolcen. If it wasn't clear enough already, I clearly do not recommend the game, and I cannot in good faith ever recommend Wolcen or anything that Wolcen Studios might make in the future. I don't trust them at all at this point. In any case, fellas, if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and thank you for watching.